So that's an interesting question, because being a new disease that started in 2019, we ask ourselves, how was this disease identified? So it was identified in China somewhere around November of 2019. The symptoms are not unusual. The symptoms what you see in clinic every day, daktari, are symptoms what we see. We see cough, we see fever or hotness of body, we see sometimes dry voice, hoarseness, sometimes headache, and other non-specific signs. So from a clinical standpoint, we do not have unique symptoms. But what happened in China was the doctors there are beginning to wonder. There's a panel where someone who presents with upper respiratory tract symptoms, they will do certain tests. Okay, it's called a panel. So a severe acute respiratory illness panel, as you can see on the screen, SARI. So this panel would be expected to see the usual viruses which cause these symptoms. So you have viruses like influenza, you have others called respiratory syncytial viruses. So they would swab the nose and look for those viruses, but they were not able to get those viruses. They were able to get a particular strain which was very interesting. Later on, they called it, the SARS-CoV-2. It was a coronavirus, and coronaviruses are generally not in humans. They're generally in bats and other animals. So initially onset, they would swab the nose and test for the usual viruses, but they would get a different virus. So even that was the initial test, and then they would sequence it, and now they would call it SARS-CoV-2, and they made it available for people to do tests all over. So the test is called a PCR, a polymerase chain reaction, that identifies that particular virus. And the name that the virus is called is SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, Coronavirus 2. Okay, so that is how it was tested, and those are the tests which are done even in the country. It is a test that is done in Cambridge, and I know they have increased centers. We have multiple centers in the country that are doing the test, but the actual test that they are doing is a PCR test that identifies that particular virus which causes these symptoms. Because the symptoms can still be from other viruses, right? But at this point, we are looking for that particular antigen.
So you've discussed about some tests called PCR tests, and there are several tests that are still on the pipeline. What are these tests that are still being developed? And you can just go more on these testing modalities that are there for the virus.
So one of the questions that everyone asks, not just in the medical field, but even policymakers, governors, is how many people are infected? I think that is a very valid question. We all want to know how many people are infected. And we know it is a disease that 80% of people don't have symptoms. So it is possible that our viewers are just feeling fine and yet they were infected or they recovered. So you ask a very important question: how do we know how much of the disease is in the community? Okay, so one of the things which the current approach is to test people who have symptoms or who have contacts. Okay, so someone who is positive and then they have contacts, then they are traced. And the test that they are using at this particular time is to look for the virus material itself, the RNA of the virus, and that is a PCR test. Okay, unfortunately, it is not 100% sensitive. There are things which, when you're taking a specimen for analysis, you have to know, is it a good quality swab? Okay, so have they gone into the posterior nose or into the oral cavity posteriorly to swab a good sample enough for it to yield results? But even with a good swab, a good specimen, the sensitivity is about 70%, which means 30% of people who are positive can still test negative. So it presents its challenges with that test. So that someone had a relative who was positive, and then they did their test, but since it's not 100%, they tested out negative of the PCR test, but in reality they are still positive. So the PCR or antigen test has its own limitations. But the other tests which are coming up, and we have more than 100 assays, is the antibody test. As we have discussed, is how the body reacts to a virus is by producing antibodies. So you can have antibodies, and the two which have been approved, you have IgG and IgM. As you can see on the screen, you have the assays, the tests that look for antibody M and IgM and IgG. One comes early, okay, in the acute phase, and then it's reduced usually by around 8 days. And then you have another one which stays for long. But this test has its own limitation. So in brief, those are the two ways you test. You can use the antigen itself or the PCR test by swabbing. We can do other blood tests which can detect the presence of an antibody or the body's response to the virus.